I'd like to start my discussion not about Somerville, but about Euclid, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland that in 1922 found themselves faced with what they felt was a substantial problem. Their village of small, modest, single-family homes was being threatened by big, large apartment buildings and significant, dirty, smelly industry. And they decided in Euclid they needed to do something about this. So their conclusion was to divide the city into different districts. And in those districts, say, well, certain uses and things could go over here or there, buildings of certain heights, certain separations between them needed to go in certain places. Uses, separation, and development intensity. Essentially, they built themselves a code for zoning to replace chaos with order and have that order be based on a compelling set of rules that everybody had to follow. But one landowner in Euclid, the Ambler Realty Company, they weren't very happy with this particular idea. They owned about 68 acres in Euclid that they wanted to build that dirty, smelly industry on, and it was now in a residential zone. So they sued the city of Euclid. In this case, in 1926, went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in 1926 determined that this concept of dividing uses and development intensity and separation, that all of these concepts were perfectly legal and constitutional. And that essentially the idea of separating this dirty industry from neighborhoods of houses was okay because while dirty industry may be a pig, as they called it, that pig should remain in the barnyard and not in a parlor. So the concept grew. Places like Euclid and 9,000 other communities just like them developed zoning codes. And while many people may look around and determine that architects and engineers and designers may create the places where we live and work, when you actually look at it a little more carefully, you'll realize that the codes, the rules we create are what creates many of the places where we live. If you look today at the way that Euclid is set up, the residential, the multifamily, everything is divided just the way it was on their zoning map. Here in Somerville, we got into this business in 1925, right as the case was still going through the Supreme Court in Ohio. We created a 35-page booklet with a map to come with it that basically divided the city up into areas and said about different development intensities and uses. And like many communities across the country over the course of the last 60 years, these things have changed. And by 1990, we have a 450-page zoning book, which is all of the cutting-edge, best ideas of how to divide your community up into these zones and districts for 1990. But think for a second about what is cutting edge for 1990, where we are in areas like data storage and in communications, even in how we chose to prioritize how we got around our cities and towns then. And as each of these things has changed and developed and adapted, many, many communities like us over the course of the last 20, 30, 40 years have not done very much with these rules. And with the zoning that remains the same, we've started to find a disconnect. I mean, here in Somerville, we talk about trying to be the most walkable and bikeable community, being, as the mayor likes to say, a more exceptional place to live, work, play, and raise a family. And at some point, we need to check how 20-something-year-old rules connect with what's going on. And we see that we basically have a system failure, one that is not unique to Somerville, but is common in a lot of communities, particularly urban communities across the country that want to become more walkable places. And so, we here in Somerville have set up on a strategy to make some significant changes, to overhaul our code, and in the next couple of months we're going to be presenting something to the Board of Aldermen that has a completely different way of looking at approaching these sort of issues, and I could talk for days about that, but I'm not going to do that here. What I want to do here is just focus on 4 key things that we have learned from our process here in Somerville that can be valuable for any community looking at asking the question of whether or not their rules and their community values are aligned as they should be. And the first is to plan first. To go start and write a zoning code without planning would be to put the cart before the horse. And essentially, we've gone out into the community, we've reached out, we've put together a 60-member steering committee that helped prepare a new comprehensive master plan called Summer Vision. It was adopted in 2012, talks about a need for growth and a need for conservation at the same time. And that's all great, but the problem with master plans is they often come with 500 written action steps, and then you have to figure out how to convert that into something that works. Well, we've taken this idea out further, out to the streets, to hear what the concerns are in individual neighborhoods and understand more what people want the design of their places to be like. Our idea in our Somerville by Design process has been to go in, meet in neighborhoods, go into empty storefronts, invite people out, have conversations, draw ideas and plans and get feedback on them, pin them up for people to stop by, present them for people to pick what they like and don't like, and build a community plan that describes what we want a place to be and what we want it to look like. The second thing we've learned is to put people over parking. And what we found is that, thank you, what we found really here is that this is a real challenge in a regulatory system. So take Gilman Square, where we're getting a new Green Line station. I try to remind myself of this when I look. These are the places that put parking over people, by the way. But Gilman Square, where we are doing our new Green Line station, and we want to make sure that we get our regulations right, we looked at some of the vacant lots around this area, and we tried to look at how the existing rules would work with it, and we come into a challenge. The challenge is that that once you put the parking in place, there isn't much left to do the rest of the things you want to do. And yet when we did the community planning process there, they talked about a community that was walkable, that was a neighborhood center, that would be good for walkability, good for the environment, but it didn't connect with where the parking rules are today. And so we need to change those rules to address those issues and make sure that we take care of the situation with parking. People always ask me, but where's everyone going to park? And well, we have a city full of places, full of buildings, full of apartments that have almost no place to park. And people live there, and people do just fine there. What we found is that when we build places with less parking, fewer people choose to live there who have lots of cars. And so we end up with less traffic and less congestion, and better for the environment. If we address these things, we can create a real people-centered place. We've discovered this even in our short-term projects. If you look at this little parking lot in Davis Square, you know, when you plan for cars, people fill it up with cars. But when we open it up for people for a couple of days, you get people. And by the way, not one of them came to me and said, I don't know where to park. The third thing is to welcome the unknown. And I think this is very important because zoning, as I said, back to the days of Euclid, really focuses on regulating uses as a priority. Somerville, our code has grown. We now have 297 uses in our table that addresses uses. I like to use this example from a community in California, though, that has something over 200 on their regulations. And as you go through this list, these are the things that they'll allow you to do in this district. You know, Turkish baths, a boxing arena. You can retail sell a chinchilla, but you cannot sell one wholesale under any circumstances. I don't even know what some of these things are. You can manufacture a potato chip, but you cannot manufacture a tortilla chip. These particular folks, for some reason, really liked their Turkish baths. But that's not working for us anymore. I mean, here in Somerville, in this building where we have places like Artisans Asylum and Greentown Labs that have multiple different businesses doing all different things, Artisans Asylum first came into my office and said, we want to do a place where we're going to do manufacturing and education. Well, what am I supposed to do with that? Those are in Section 5 and Section 14 of our use table. They're two completely different things. You can't do that. And we had to figure out how to make them fit into our rules. And that was a really tricky thing to do under a set of rules like this. Fringe Union, which is also doing all sorts of different businesses together, and take the Rogers Foam Corporation. This building is tucked right into the middle of a residential neighborhood, and they have Rogers Foam in the Vernon Street studios where they manufacture custom foam and custom art in the same place, right around everybody around them. And the reality is there are no pigs in any barnyards here or in any parlors here. We've realized that these are much more harmless. And that's why we're looking at creating a fabrication district that we can apply in places in Somerville that can be locations where we want to make sure businesses like this thrive and they don't get turned over to things that lose the ability for us to have those places that can allow this creative industry to thrive. And I think communities looking to make sure creativity lasts can make sure to do that, and in those places can start grouping stuff together rather than putting things by long lists of uses that make it tough to make things work. Our fourth lesson is to measure what you care about. Every community has those neighborhoods they love that just feel so great to them and just work so well. And you want to make these places great places to thrive and live and raise a family and stay for generations, maybe even like so many people have in Somerville. But there are challenges with doing that sometimes in the way that our codes work. I'll give you just two examples. SETBACKS, which is a great regulation to specify where you cannot build a building, but not necessarily to specify what goes into that little square once you do build it, and whether or not it looks anything like what's around it. And floor area ratio, a technical concept us planners talk about all the time. It was borrowed from building skyscrapers in New York City and brought pretty much everywhere in the country, applied in residential neighborhoods where you basically determine area of a building to area of a lot. It's like based upon your lot size, you're handed like a little can of Play-Doh, and you can kind of mold that Play-Doh any way you want to create whatever building you can on that particular lot based upon that size. But problem with Play-Doh is you can create great buildings, but you can also create dinosaurs. And you know, we have our share where people have gotten a little creative with our floor area ratio rules, and they start to do things to Somerville houses that don't quite make sense. So we get stuck in this situation whereby a house like this is something that gets neighbors all upset because they're like, well, how can the rules possibly let you do that? Meanwhile, a neighborhood like this comes in and they want to build a little dormer or a little addition on the back of their house, and they're having to come into the zoning board to get all these variances and appeals and all this other stuff and everything. And it makes life interesting at our zoning board meetings because you get a group of people unhappy about what they can't do, a group of people unhappy about what their neighbors are trying to do, and it makes every one of these meetings quite the exciting scene. We decided we're going to take a different approach to neighborhoods like this. We're measuring. We're trying to understand what the DNA of a Somerville neighborhood is really about. And we've created a set of examples of what these houses look like, how they work, what makes the most sense, and then have made it possible to describe what the types of buildings are that might fit into the middle of our neighborhoods, to make them fit with what's around them so that neighborhoods can grow organically but still feel like they belong as one place and work together. And at the same time, put components together that work with these buildings so that if people want to add a dormer or add an addition, you can do something that makes some sense and fits with its neighbors but doesn't completely overwhelm it. And the combination of those two pieces, the building types and the building components, can make it possible to live in one's neighborhood and raise a family and make changes and do what's necessary to do in a way that makes more sense. I like to say it's more like using Legos than Play-Doh. You have all the pieces to make a house, and you can make those pieces work. So I call the concept zoning by design, and I think it's a concept that makes sense for Somerville and also makes sense for any community looking to make sure that their rules match where their community wants to go. It's based upon the 4 simple principles of planning first, putting people before parking, inviting the unknown, and measuring what you care about. And as a part of that, it's also important that we make sure those fit into our goals of making Somerville a more exceptional place to live, work, play, and raise a family, and at the same time, make sure that we are working to make our city greater, better, and more beautiful, as the ancient Athenians said about their cities so long ago. Thank you.